Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 4th annual Edward and Emily McWhinney Memorial Lecture. My name is Dimitris Krallis, and I'm director of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University and a professor of Byzantine History at the Department of Humanities. Before we get this event going, I would like to acknowledge that this event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Quiquixem peoples. Together, today's event was organized by my colleague, Dr. James Horncastle, the Edward and Emily McWhinney Professor in International Relations at the Department of Humanities. Thank you, Jamie. I would also like to thank Lauren Gilbert, our SNF Center Events Coordinator, for her crucial assistance in every aspect of this digital event. The Edward and Emily McWhinney Memorial Lecture was established in 2017 to honor the memory of two long-time friends and supporters of Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University, and is dedicated to contemporary issues in international relations and politics. Ted and Emily were committed to academic excellence and public service, and our annual lecture is part of the couple's lasting legacy to our university. Edward Watson McWhinney was a graduate of Yale University, where he received his doctorate in constitutional and international law, before embarking on a postdoctoral tour of a series of prestigious academic establishments that was followed by a distinguished teaching career in institutions that ranged from Yale, Toronto, McGill, Indiana, and Simon Fraser University. Dr. McWhinney straddled the worlds of academia, policy, and public service by serving as member and special advisor of the Canadian delegation to the United Nations General Assembly and consultant to the Secretary General of the United Nations, but also as Crown Prosecutor, Royal Commissioner of Inquiry, as well as constitutional and international law advisor to several Quebec premiers, to the Premier of Ontario, the federal government of Canada, and to a number of foreign governments. Dr. McWhinney was elected in the Canadian Federal Parliament twice, and during his time in politics, served as Parliamentary Secretary on Fisheries and Foreign Affairs. In '97, Dr. McWhinney was awarded the Aristotle Medal by the Greek government for his contribution to the progress of science, free thought, and intellectual development. Professor Emeritus Edward McWhinney passed away in 2015 on his 91st birthday. He was predeceased by his wife, Emily McWhinney, in 2011. This lecture honors the public discussion of the topics that animated the McWhinney's professional and intellectual lives. We remain grateful for their contributions, which include the support of graduate student work at SFU, and notably the endowment of the Edward and Emily McWhinney Professorship in International Relations. Thank you for listening. I now leave this to our speaker for the introduction.
Thank you, Dimitri. I am pleased to introduce Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, Mylonas, from George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He is the Editor-in-Chief of Nationality Papers, published by Cambridge University Press for the Association for the Study of Nationalities. He recently served as Associate Dean for Research at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and he is the chair of the Council for European Studies Historical Study of States and Regimes Research Network since 2019. Mylonas' work contributes to our understanding of states' management of diversity that may originate from national minorities, immigrants, diasporas, or refugees. He is particularly interested in the role of decision makers' perceptions about foreign involvement in their domestic affairs and the impact these perceptions have on the planning and implementation of state policies. He is the author of The Politics of Nation Building, Making Co-Nationals, Refugees, and Minorities from Cambridge University Press in 2013, for which he won the 2014 European Studies Book Award by the Council for European Studies, as well as the Peter Katzenstein Book Prize in 2013. Mylonas' work has been published in several journals and edited volumes. He is currently working on his next book, tentatively titled Diaspora Management Logics, where he analyzes various governmental decisions vis-a-vis different diaspora segments. The recent political and financial crisis in Europe, with Greece at its epicenter, occupied much of his attention in the past 10 years. He published a series of op-eds in numerous news outlets, as well as more analytical pieces, academic articles, and chapters in edited volumes. Since 2010, he writes the annual report on developments in Greece for the European Journal of Political Research, and since 2018, He contributes to the Freedom House reports on Greece and Cyprus. His documentary film, Searching for Andreas, Political Leadership in Times of Crisis, which also deals with the deep causes of the recent financial and political crisis in Greece, premiered at the 2018 Thessaloniki Documentary Festival and won 2 awards at the 2019 International Documentary Festival at Europetra. Today's lecture, Charismatic Leadership and its Discontents, the Case of Greece, will build upon our understanding of Greece's patronage contract, i.e. the party-dominated patron-client networks that reproduce the political and economic system which had existed since the country's independence, but was bureaucratized during the post-junta period, which gradually deteriorated after 2010 as a result of the stipulations in the MoUs signed with the country's creditors. To explain the severity of the political transformation in Greece relative to other crisis-stricken countries of the eurozone, Aris will examine his research on the legacy of 2 charismatic leaders, Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou. So before we get going to our keynote presentation, there's a little bit of housekeeping I would like to take care of first. I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit SFU IT Services website, whose link can be found in the same email provided to access the webinar. At the conclusion of the lecture, we will host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will try our best to address them all afterwards. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise your hand button and an audiovisual assistant will unmute you. Finally, a reminder to please be kind and respectful. Anyone not adhering to this will be promptly removed. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Associate Professor Aris Mylonas.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Dimitri, for the introduction also, and to Lauren for organizing this event. And thank you, of course, to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies, and to the Simon Fraser University, of course, at large. I'm really honored to be invited to give the 4th annual Edward and Emily McWhinney lecture. And I'm sad that we couldn't do it last year, but I'm glad we have this opportunity now. So I'm going to begin my talk by sharing first my slides in the Zoom world. The background to the crisis refers to the recent financial crisis that Greece went through starting in 2008, late 2008. We started realizing that Greece had a lot of problems, as you know, and specifically financing its debt and its deficit that it had. And going into 2009, when we had the early elections, snap elections called by then Prime Minister Kostas Karamanlis, we realized a few things, and those things had certain implications for Greece and its political system. So I'm going to unpack some of these right now for those of you who, let's say, have not had the opportunity or the interest to follow when all of this happened. So first of all, I'm going to give you a version of what I think led to the crisis. So I argue that the electoral cycles, and I'm not the only one to argue this, but I'm going to summarize a bunch of arguments here. The electoral cycles by cartel parties capturing the state and engaging in machine politics could only be sustained by what I called already large budget deficits and an exorbitant debt. So just to give you a sense, this is a graph I've created that builds on data that basically mainly comes from the IMF, but not just the IMF. It shows you up to 2009 how Greece's public debt was doing. You can see that after 2009, it kind of takes off. But obviously, this is a situation that has been building up for a long time. So the first slide, whatever I said about electoral cycles and the spending and the, it kind of builds on that. So when the political establishment, I argue, could no longer finance its this particular scheme or these electoral cycles, and in general the political system, from international capital markets, then it had to negotiate a loan agreement with the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF, what ended up being called the so-called Troika. Now, that in itself led to what we call forced reforms in the literature. And there is particularly a good edited volume with this in its title. And I sent you some links that you can follow some of these writings. Now, that meant that what I call the patronage contract, in other words, the party-dominated patron-client networks, which reproduced the political and economic system which existed since independence, but was bureaucratized during the post-junta period, gradually deteriorated since 2010. And that was a result of these MoUs, right, that were signed with the country's creditors, the so-called Troika. And that led to several measures that basically led to the deterioration of this patronage contract, as I call it, instead of a what you would call a social contract, right? And it had all sorts of stipulations, including freezes in public sector employment and so forth. So this is kind of a very short introduction to how I see how Greece ended up being the weakest link in the European Union monetary community, so the eurozone. Now, of course, there are international and other types of conditions, but here is a view from below, in a way, the view from Greece, not so much the broader discussion about what was the role of Germany and the eurozone countries and the US crisis in this. So it's more of a domestic explanation that I highlight here. The reason I do that is because I want to link these developments with what I call a crisis of representation. And this crisis of representation takes several forms. First, it was a crisis in what we call trust in institutions. And that is, let's see here, sorry. It's depicted here with data from Eurobarometer, and it shows you how trust in government and trust in parties plummeted basically gradually from 2002 onwards. We have a lot of problems, but they of course get exacerbated, as you can see, around 2007, 2008, and it goes, really low after that. Now, beyond that, we also see over time a drop in turnout, and particularly again, as you see around 2008, 2009, we start seeing voter turnout going down. All of these are elements, in my view, of crisis of representation, as I call it, but also it builds towards what I will call later a legitimation crisis. Here in this graph, you can see how the party system that, after 1981 or so, you can say early 80s, it was a very solid, almost, we would say, archetypical two-party system. We see it faltering basically and almost disappearing around 2012. And then again, only one of its polls, New Democracy, kind of sort of surviving, but still at really low levels by 2015. So this is another indication of the crisis that I was talking to you about. And if you look at the situation with the public debt, the things don't get much better. Obviously, they kind of plateaued in a really bad situation after 2009, when I stopped the graph earlier. So we're talking about an exorbitant debt, and the deficits that Greece was running up to 2009 were unsustainable. So what happens as a result of all these developments and the breakdown, the deterioration of the patronage contract, is what I call a cleavage transformation. This cleavage transformation means that, before we would talk about left and right, or we would talk about the socially conservative versus progressive parties, and so on and so forth, more traditional divisions. Suddenly, for those of you who know the story, it's not surprising, we get a new political cleavage that becomes dominant in the Greek case. And that's the political cleavage that we could briefly summarize as memorandum versus anti-memorandum, or austerity versus anti-austerity type of parties. That cleavage emerges initially in May 2010 with the first vote for the first MoU, first Memorandum of Understanding with the so-called Troika. I'm using the term for brevity purposes here. And you see that the parties that represent the yes vote are, in this point in time, are the ones that you could call pro-memorandum or pro-austerity at the time. And then the no vote is could be seen as the parties that represent the anti-austerity bloc. Now, as you can see, this keeps on changing. New Democracy, for example, which is currently the governing party in Greece, switched from anti-austerity party in 2010 to a pro-austerity party in 2012. And that was a huge transition, right? So basically this cleavage, this line between yes and no, kind of defined up until 2015, August 2015, from 2010 for 5 years, defined the main political division in Greece, was the main political division in Greece. So I'm giving you this background so that you can understand how transformative this financial crisis that became an deep economic recession, actually, how fundamental it was. So all of these together led and were part of, in a way, what I would call a legitimation crisis. And in a way, it was also further manifested in moving from right to left here in your screen, to 7 prime ministers, although I'm counting also caretaker governments here, in 6 years. So we get at least 4 directly elected in 6 years, right? So Kostas Karamanlis is the prime minister when the whole thing explodes. George Papandreou wins the election in 2009 and basically starts governing in October 2009. And then we have a technocratic government with Lucas Papadimos, who is not directly elected, but he's supported by parties who were, of course. And then Adonis Samaras and Tsipras take us to the end of the crisis, at least in terms of the memorandum of understanding being signed, and then an exit technically from that. So that's a lot of change in government for such a short period, and I think captures some of this turbulence. Another way to kind of capture this crisis of legitimation or representation crisis is to look at the multiple leadership changes. In a way, if you think about it, if you look at the political map of Greece in 2009, and then look at it again today, the only leader of a party that is still the leader of their party is Alexis Tsipras from the parties that existed back then, right? So you get a lot of turnaround, let's say, and changes in leadership. New Democracy has at least 3, different leaders. Well, the Democratic Left that is at the very right of your screen no longer exists, has been folded into Syriza now, but it had been part of the movement for change, which was a new version of PASOK, let's say, or a revamped PASOK for many, or a downgraded PASOK for others. So that's a contested issue. PASOK had changes in leadership as well. So you get a lot of other signs of, let's say, a crisis. It's changing leadership in political parties is yet another sign to an extent that these leaders were not doing as well. At least that's how things work in Greece. It's not that we have term limits of that sort. And that was the introduction to kind of convince you that there was something terribly problematic, or if you want, terribly important happening in Greece as a result of the financial crisis and the economic recession, but not just because of that, as I will argue. So the question that I will spend most of the rest of the talk trying to address, and is the key question in a way implied also in the title of today's talk, is why did Greece experience such a strong blow to its party system relative to other eurozone countries that also signed loan agreements and implemented stringent austerity measures, right? So it's not that Greece was the only one. So why did we see all of these different manifestations of crisis in Greece and its party system, but we didn't see as deep of a blow to the party systems of other such cases? And I argue that in order to explain, and that's kind of like a preview of the argument, I don't expect everybody to follow this slide and then be convinced and be over with, because that would be a really short talk. But here's a preview of the argument. So I argue that to explain the severity of the political transformation in Greece relative to other crisis-stricken countries of the eurozone, we need to first consider the interminable succession crisis that ensued within the two dominant parties, Nea Demokratia and PASOK, New Democracy, and the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement. Following the departure of the two charismatic leaders, I will argue, that molded post-junta Greece. And these two figures are depicted on the screen, Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou. So now, before I continue, some of you may be thinking of the term charismatic in a more colloquial way, or may be baffled that I call any of the two or both of them charismatic. So I wanted to clarify this point by giving a short, we're going to take a short detour to give kind of the theoretical underpinnings of this talk, which basically built quite a bit on the work by Max Weber, a really, seminal sociologist who published studies on charismatic authority in the early 20th century. And here, the way I use the term charismatic is strictly in the Weberian sense. So these two leaders in my framework were charismatic in a Weberian sense of the term, right? So it's not using the term in the way that we would use it in everyday discourse. It's more in a way to discuss them in the theoretical framework of Max Weber. So in fact, we could argue that these leaders are not, uniquely, obviously, charismatic from a Weberian sense in the Greek context. There has been a lot of work on Eleftherios Venizelos, another really charismatic in that sense leader, work done by Professor Mavrocordatos and others, on elaborating basically how he was charismatic, but also the limitations of charismatic leadership in that particular case. So in a way, you could say that to an extent, I'm extending some of this analysis that already existed for Eleftherios Venizelos to the contemporary era. and there have been other people who have written about this, but I'm linking it directly to the political consequences of the crisis. So what is charismatic authority for Max Weber? Charismatic authority is sharply opposed both to rational and to traditional authority. Those are the other two forms of authority that Max Weber highlights. And charismatic authority exists when people follow a leader based on a belief in his or her supernatural powers. Okay, so already you start seeing that, you know, charismatic authority doesn't necessarily mean what we usually mean when we say someone is charismatic in everyday language. So it is not respect for rational principles, which would be rational authority, or tradition, that would be traditional authority, that motivate the followers, right? And motivate them into action, but rather their complete devotion to the extraordinary and unheard of, to what is alien to all regulation and tradition, and therefore is viewed as divine. So from that perspective, a charismatic leader is perceived by their followers as having supernatural powers and almost, you know, somehow being akin to divine being. Of course, the people who don't like the charismatic leader, which usually is a polarizing figure, often think of it as the opposite, as the devil incarnate, right? So now a second, and by the way, you know, Max Weber unearthed this term charismatic, the notion of charisma, let's say, from Rudolf Sohm, who was basically writing about the Christian church, just to give you a sense of the genealogy of the usage of the term. And basically, he thought of the Christian church not as a legal, but rather as a charismatic organization, meaning an organization that was established by virtue of divine inspiration, not human law, right? So similarly, Weber uses this term in order to show or to designate a leader charismatic. It would basically mean that it's something like a divine supernatural type of leader. So he uses consciously this term that comes from the study of the Christian church, because he thinks that the followers of such leaders think of those leaders in those ways. So movements or parties led by a charismatic leader, and that brings us to the discussion of the limitations, right, of charismatic leadership. Basically, those movements that are led by charismatic leaders are temporary due to the biological limitations of their leaders. And if they are to survive at all, they must find a routine basis of organization, what he calls a routine basis of organization. Now, you may be asking, what is that? That's the famous, you know, it leads us to the famous term of routinization of charisma. And the routinization of charisma for Weber takes the form of the appropriation of powers and of economic advantages by the followers or disciples, and of regulating recruitment. So that's one way to routinize charisma. So in a way, this is just giving you a sense of how would a charismatic movement be able to survive following the departure of its founder and leader. Now, the problem, though, of routinizing charisma through these ways that I've quoted from Weber's work here, and I will argue in a minute that that's how charisma was routinized in the Greek case. It's that when these economic advantages to the followers or disciples dry up, the organization falters, right? So in other words, you cannot sustain that organization, right, if you don't have those economic advantages to distribute. Okay, so that's what Weber has told us about charismatic authority and charismatic movements. How is that relevant in our case? I will argue, I'll make a few statements about how the personalistic governance style pioneered by these two charismatic leaders on your screen, Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou, habituated Greeks to this type of leadership, undermined the development of internal party democracy, and that's crucial, of course, for institutionalization of a party, blurred the division of the legislative, executive, and judicial functions of government, and ensured internal opposition against all successors. So, on top of that, the personalistic style of governance also encouraged a state-led type of capitalism. That's not inevitable, of course, in terms of charismatic leadership, but we're talking about this particular case now, right? So a lot of these statements I made are in particular about the Greek case. Now, again, to be fair, we can't blame Constantine Karamanlis and, or not necessarily blame, but attribute to both of them the same things. We can definitely make a statement that Andreas Papandreou's, Andreas's role in particular, habituated the voters to populist discourse and practices and a state-led corporatist development of civil society. That doesn't mean that the other parties didn't follow suit, especially the main opposition or the main other party, let's say of the two-party system, New Democracy. But definitely we can say that Andreas was a key actor in this development. So a lot of these things that I mentioned so far were common to both Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou, just from the very nature of the charismatic leadership style. But Andreas had extra elements in his way of running his party and the government that further deepened these problems. Now, why all of this background is necessary, it will become obvious in the next slide. So both parties, both New Democracy and PASOK, had to replace these charismatic leaders, right? The first succession crisis occurred in the early 1980s and involved New Democracy when Constantine Karamanlis stepped down, and there was a lot of let's say commotion and a lot of antagonism within the party for who is going to succeed Constantine Karamanlis, and it was unclear whether anyone could really fill his shoes, right? So Constantine Mitsotakis, which is he's the politician you can see on your left, was the one who basically prevailed in the end after a short interim where other leaders were at the helm of New Democracy. But he's the main, let's say, successor for for enough time to bring him up. And many would agree with me, I think, maybe not everybody, that he didn't manage to basically fully dominate or to basically fully own, let's say in quotation marks, New Democracy as a party. Similarly, in the mid-1990s in PASOK, the election of Kostas Simitis at the leadership of the party was really important and signaled a lot of changes of direction for PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist movement. But we can hardly say that Kostas Simitis had full control of the party, and I can address some of these details at the Q&A. I don't want to bore you with a lot of details on this front. So basically, the succession crises were detrimental to the continuity of these dominant parties, despite the fact that the immediate successors of the two charismatic leaders failed to institutionalize charisma in the party, right? Sorry, were not detrimental. So that's a puzzle, right? Both of them did not manage, as I said, to control the party, right? And they didn't manage to do what we call routinize the charisma or institutionalize the charisma in the party. But those two parties did not collapse. In fact, Constantine Mitsotakis became a prime minister in the early 90s, and Kostas Simitis won elections in a row, and only lost in 2004 to Kostas Karamanlis, the nephew of Constantine Karamanlis. So he stayed in power for 8 years. So for a while, as I said, it looked like both parties had averted this grave scenario that Weber would have predicted, right? The demise or the death, let's say, of the political party as a result of the departure of the charismatic leader who brought it about, right? So the resilience of these two parties, I will argue, largely dependent on loans from the international capital markets and the European Economic Community, later on the EU, because initially it was not called the EU, obviously, funds. So this was the way that, in a way that those economic advantages I talked about, who helped Britannize charisma initially, kept both of these parties, I would argue, alive. So on top of that, of course, remember, there was a pretty solid two-party system that kind of ensured that spoils would be available for either side at some point, right? So the continuation of the patronage contract was the institutional form that routinization of charisma took in Greece, or in the Greek context. Electoral cycles continued, and so did tax evasion. And both of these electoral cycles and tax evasion were at the heart of Greece looking like and being the weakest link of the eurozone when the international financial crisis kind of erupted. So now this brings us to the problem, what I call the problem of succession, that hides or kind of always comes with a certain level of a legitimation crisis. But in the case of Greece, where the legitimation crisis, the internal legitimation crisis within the party of any successor, was kind of delayed for years through this patronage contract that I discussed, and because Greece was able to finance this electoral cycle and tax evasion kind of equilibrium through international markets, funding from international markets. Now, the global financial crisis that you see on your screens here, kind of like a lightning, broke that possibility of perpetuating this, and led or made apparent a crisis of political representation. So more specifically, when the 2008 financial crisis hit Greece, biological successors of these two charismatic leaders I started my discussion with, Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou, were in power. In fact, they actually basically were both there when Greece, when this ticking bomb exploded basically in Greece. Kostas Karamanlis was the prime minister who called the snap election, and George Papandreou, the son of Andreas Papandreou, was the one who basically signed the first memorandum of understanding with the so-called Troika. So from a Weberian point of view, this made very clear the situation was very clear that charisma was not present in either of these two in the way that Weber would define it. And since charisma is not hereditary, and the legacy of the two charismatic leaders was still palpable, all these things that I mentioned earlier, that personalistic style of governance had left. And these two political parties, New Democracy and PASOK, had not managed to institutionalize themselves and to have internal party democracy and to cultivate those things and to overcome some of these legacies, let's say, of those two charismatic leaders. That led to a situation where the system basically more or less collapsed. So once the dominant parties could no longer uphold their side of the patronage contract, a legitimation crisis ensued. Now, this collapse of the two-party system that we saw also earlier in the graph, basically, in politics, there is no void of that sort, right? So in Greece, the parties that dominated the two-party system for 3 decades were actually, in the end, defeated by a new party, or actually relatively new party, not that new, that had saw a meteoric rise during the years of crisis, Syriza. And you see Alexis Tsipras on your left in the screen right now. And that party won, the Coalition of the Radical Left is its full name, won in 2 elections during 2015 and governed with the support of a right-wing party. Again, that probably for a lot of you will seem odd if you're not following Greek politics. How would the Coalition of the Radical Left govern with the support of right-wing independent Hellenes, whose leader you can see on your right, on the right of the screen, Panos Kamenos? That happened, again, along those lines of the anti-austerity new political cleavage that I discussed in the beginning of the talk. Both of these parties were on the same side of that spectrum. And of course, then power was, governing was the glue that kept them together, even after they both actually signed on the 3rd memorandum of understanding and basically de facto became, after the summer of 2015, when the 3rd memorandum was voted in parliament, they became de facto pro-austerity parties, right? Because they had to implement harsh austerity measures. Now, I would venture say, and I would argue that the culmination of what I call the legitimation crisis in Greece was the summer of 2015. And again, I'm not saying that in a moral or let's say, I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm just descriptively arguing that the fact that in the referendum that was called by Prime Minister Tsipras then, basically to vote on the draft proposals for the 3rd bailout, whether the Greek people accepted those proposals or not, which was a very weird way of phrasing a referendum question, and we can discuss that at the Q&A. So that referendum in early July of 2015 basically came out a resounding no. More than 60% of the voters voted no. But as I said, nevertheless, the agreement was ratified by the Greek parliament with a really large majority, including, of course, the 2 coalition partners, governing coalition partners. I would say that could be seen as a culmination of the legitimation crisis, where the political system, the elites representing the people, the voters, did not work along the lines of what you would expect them to do given the results of the referendum. Now, turning to today's party system, and basically a few years after the culmination of what I call the legitimation crisis, which I see as directly linked to the discontents that come from charismatic leadership, right? Because I think that the demise of the party system, both how the party system worked and the equilibrium of what I call the patronage contract, were a result of a lot of these policies of these 2 charismatic leaders with different levels of responsibility, but still with similar results in terms of habituating voters and certain expectations and practices. The party system is trying in Greece today to find its footing, and it's not very easy to make predictions, but I'll close with a few observations. First, many observers rushed to identify Alexis Tsipras as the next charismatic leader for Greece in 2015 when he was elected. He, at the same time, of course, as charismatic leaders often are, he has been accused as just basically a copycat or someone just mimicking Andreas Papandreou. And others, though, have actually perceived him as a symbolic successor of Andreas Papandreou. So that has been a really hotly debated topic. Now, with from today's vantage point, it seems that Alexis Tsipras has lost a lot of this initial, let's say, aura that he had. And he is facing a lot of internal opposition, and he has been pushed aside quite a bit by the very dynamic presence of Kyriakos Mitsotakis as prime minister since July of 2019. Turning to PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, which transformed into the Movement for Change, KINAL, Fofi Ginimata, hasn't managed, obviously, to resurrect the electoral presence of the party, which has plummeted since the crisis hit Greece. And it seems unlikely that the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement in any incarnation will be able to resurrect itself. Now, many people argue that Syriza has become the home of many former followers of Andreas Papandreou and so forth, but that still doesn't go against the Weberian hypothesis that it's partly because of the departure of the charismatic leader that PASOK has not been able to find and the inability, of course, of successors to institutionalize the party. PASOK has not been able to keep its electoral presence intact. Others, of course, have emphasized the need to move beyond the search of charismatic leaders who will save the country and build strong, rational legal forms of authority through strong institutions instead. And in a way, that remains to be seen if Kyriakos Mitsotakis can manage, for example, within Nea Demokratia, which is not a party he had the full control of. Actually, it was really hard for him to become the president of the party back in 2016, and it happened with several coalitions. The question is whether he will be able to take the control of the party and fully and institutionalize, as we would say, charisma, and not rely so much on these figures, in his case, Constantine Karamanlis, and be able to move into a direction where that shadow and the internal politics of this legacy of a charismatic leader as a founder will be a thing of the past. So I leave you with a question. What is the future for Greece? Is it going to be charismatic? Is it going to be rational legal or traditional authority? And that's a really important question. It remains to be seen whether the mentality of the Greek voters and politicians has changed enough for the rational legal form of authority to take root in the country. And, that's something that we can only hope for, maybe, some of us at least, but I will refrain from making a prediction on that front. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
All right, thank you, Harry. So it's actually a very thought-provoking talk, and I'd like to thank you. And I have quite a few questions as well. But first, I thought I'd give a reminder to the audience. Members of the audience, feel free to ask questions by typing your question to the Q&A box or using the raise your hand feature. Is there any questions to start off before I launch into some of my own questions as well? Dimitri, of course, take it away.
So, Harry, thank you very much for trip through memory lane and, of course, for reflections on all this. My question, I guess, is about the relationship between charismatic leadership and populism. Because the one interesting thing that we might probably agree is that Papandreou and Karamanlis are, I mean, the elders, the originals, are both perhaps charismatic leaders, but they're not both populists. And I wonder how that works. And I guess the follow-up to that, not directly related, is the succession crisis that you mentioned, which is this very interesting moment where with both Mitsotakis and Simitis, and perhaps now with the younger Mitsotakis, you have a moment of reckoning for charismatic leadership. It appears as if these are the moments where Greek society starts seeking something very different. But that difference does not materialize with Simitis and Mitsotakis, the elder, and it remains to be seen what happens with the younger. I'll leave it at that.
Can you, I'll answer the first one. I'll ask you to repeat the second one again so that we don't.
Yeah, I mean, what is the, can we treat Mitsotakis the elder and Simitis as moments where, in the instance where a perpetuation of, what is the expression, the regularization of charisma,
routinization,
routinization of charisma, where instead of that, there is almost an attempt for the anti-charisma. Because I would see both Mitsotakis and Simitis as anti-charismatic leaders who try to invoke this rational, legal...
And fail.
And fail
that's
miserably because their parties are not that.
But that's my argument. Yeah, that's part of the argument. That's what. Yeah. So the second, well, I guess you answered your own question in a way, but in the second one. But let me start with the first one. It's a really critical question today, and then I see we start getting some Q&A questions that we'll see whether James will moderate them or whether I should directly answer them. Whatever you want.
I can ask them to you after each one if you'd like.
Yeah. Yeah, so so Dimitri, thank you for the question. First of all, let's start with clarifying that what I see as charismatic, you may see as populist, right? And that's kind of, in a way, that's in the definitional statement almost of Weberian charismatic, is that you will see as negative the one I see as positive if we are on the different sides. In fact, it's almost necessary that almost half of the, roughly speaking, a big chunk of the population will see you as an evil person, right? In that sense, Karamanlis was not as a polarizing figure in the post-junta Greece period, but he was much more polarizing in the previous period, right? So I think he gets the term charismatic, which in a Weberian sense, also for his presence, obviously, before, right? The junta. So when he was vilified, obviously, by the father of Andreas Papandreou, actually, to give some of this history, and of course, a big chunk of the Greek population also thought of him as a hero. So that's another, that's where the credibility, right, of Constantine Karamanlis as a Weberian charismatic leader, in a way, comes from. While in his later states, in the post-junta, version, let's say, of Constantine Karamanlis, he's a much more, he's trying to polarize less, right? He's a less polarizing figure. So you're right on that front. So from a metapolitevsi, let's say, perspective, from a post-dictatorship perspective, you're right that we could say that Karamanlis has very few elements of what you would call a populist leader. Even from his enemies would not accuse him as a populist, and that's true. While Andreas Papandreou is actually he's the stereotypical populist, right? Now that doesn't mean that charismatic and populist are orthogonal. They're actually overlapping, right? As I said, from a Weberian sense, right? Now the problem happens, or the problem emerges from the fact that we often conflate the term charismatic with everyday usage, which is like a positive connotation, right? And then populist is usually, in today's world at least, not in the US yet fully, but in Europe for sure, and maybe in Canada, is seen as a negative term, right? Because as you know, populist in the US context wasn't a negative thing. It was like a man of the people or a woman of the people, right? So it's someone who is representing the people. Bernie Sanders was proudly calling himself a populist. Obama called himself a populist, right? So populism is not always a negative term in the US context, right? But I see how you meant it. So I think charismatic and populist often overlaps, especially because, analytically speaking, I mean, because often both as a negative and as a positive thing, right? Because a charismatic leader is representing the people, right? Has these supernatural powers and everybody feels a connection to them. But at the same time, their enemies also see them in the negative view of the populist term that you were implying, I think, in your question, that they're manipulators and, demagogues, basically. That's another way of saying what you meant by populist, I guess, is a demagogue, right?
Can I clarify the populist? Yeah. I'm thinking about it in more of the definitions that Takis Papas would give to the term, which is a person who constructs the cleavages within society as elite versus the people. I'm not thinking about it in the broad terminology. And that's how I saw Karamanlis as not fitting the category.
Well, yeah, but if you think Karamanlis or tanks, that's not a very good dilemma either, right? So I see your point. Actually, since you brought, so Takis has made this argument about PASOK, right? And he has a book about the Charismatic Party in 2008. When actually everybody was kind of like saying, well, what are you talking about? A year later, PASOK won with like a huge percentage, and he was arguing PASOK is finished, right? And he was basically building on Weber's thinking as much as I am here. The only difference is that I think Takis, if I understand correctly, his understanding today, he thinks that Netmokratia is kind of immune to this problem. It's or not immune, but has gone over this problem and won't suffer from it as much as PASOK. I still am not sure that this is the case. I actually would say that I don't think having quite a bit of knowledge of that party, I'm not sure these problems are settled in Netmokratia. Now, of course, there is the gluing power of having government, being in government. But it remains to be seen whether Weber was wrong or not wrong, actually, whether the Weberian prerequisite, which is routinization of charisma or some sort of institutionalization or rational legal kind of approach, will dominate in Netmokratia, right? And that's the big bet that Kyriakos Mitsotakis will have to deal with. Charismatic leaders by necessity are with the people, in my view, right? Because so by definition, they have these supernatural powers in the eyes of their followers. So do they all argue in these black or white ways? We would need to take case by case kind of situations. You're right, the Venizelos did not have that type of what you would call populist, right, approach. And he was charismatic from the perspective of Weber. So maybe that would be a good example to distinguish Venizelos from Andreas, right? Because Andreas used the discourse But that's not the reason why he was charismatic. Do you see what I'm saying? So there is this falma of synthesis that can happen there, right? It's not that you become charismatic if you may be called the populist by Papas if you do that, but right. Although I think he has other criteria, also being a liberal and all that, right? But from a Weberian perspective, it doesn't really matter what's the content of your arguments, right? So you could be charismatic with a populist agenda, in quotation marks, or you can be charismatic with a liberal agenda. The charismaticness has to do with the way you, how authority is manifesting itself. Is it traditional, is it rational, legal, or is it charismatic, right? So it's all about different forms of authority for him. And I think that's still a good way of analyzing this, because the content of what you're arguing is very context specific. I think Andreas, in today's political environment in Greece, would probably have gone with a different message. You know, just think about it, right? I mean, do you think Andreas would have gone with the same arguments? I mean, in fact, he himself changed his chants and arguments every other week. So it's not like, so saying that Andreas was like elite versus the people, I think it's a caricature of who Andreas was and what he said. For those of us who grew up in Greece in the 80s, I think we've heard enough arguments by him that, you know, it's kind of unclear what he actually stood for in some cases, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, excellent. Questions are starting to come in here now, so I'll go in them in the order. So first off, we have two questions from Martha. The first question is, would term limits on party leaders help to transition to a rational model? And as a second question, what type of leadership could solve the refugee crisis in what ways? Or in other words, what type of solutions would be proposed by different types of leaders, charismatic, rational, traditional, on solving the refugee crisis in Greece?
Wow. Well, that second one is, you know, a difficult one. Well, first of all, the term limits, actually, that brings me to answer also Dimitris' second question to an extent, the one about anti-charismatic as being a platform, right? So Mitsotakis, Constantine Mitsotakis, the father of the current prime minister, and Kostas Simitis, both of them tried the rational legal route to an extent, right? And as we said, they failed. In fact, they kind of presented themselves. Constantine Mitsotakis had to present himself almost as that anti-charismatic in order to juxtapose himself to Andreas, who was the charismatic, right? So in a way, it was a strategy almost, right? It's not that Constantine Mitsotakis was not a really savvy leader. Obviously he was. And he could have, you know, and he did polarize as much as he could. But he was polarizing from, you know, this perspective of I'm the responsible kind of anti-charismatic, anti-populist, if you want, leader, right? That worked in terms of the elections, but it didn't work internally in the party, right? That's my modest argument here, right? And we'll see whether it will work with Kyriakos in power, right? Because Kyriakos is doing a similar approach. Kyriakos is not presenting himself, and I'm speaking in a way still to Dimitris' question, he's not presenting himself as a charismatic leader. And that wasn't his profile, right? And he hasn't promised everything, right? He hasn't been he hasn't followed that route, which he could have tried. Instead, he's choosing a route closer to his father's, I would say, in terms of like how he approaches how he positions himself, right? On the other hand, Simitis also never did that, because obviously it would have been a tough comparison because he was just succeeding Andreas Papandreou right after he died, right? So it would have been a tough, even if he wanted, he couldn't probably, right? I think in terms of Kostas Simitis, we can say, but also he didn't want to, right? That was who he was, right? So I agree with you, but he didn't manage to actually succeed in what we would call institutionalizing charisma in the party. So both failed in different points in time to do that. And that led to a point that I didn't make as clear maybe in my presentation, but it's going to be much more clear in the film you're going to watch on Wednesday. That basically both parties, exactly because of the failures, Dimitri, of the two attempts that we talked about, of these anti-charismatic leaders, in quotation marks, and again, in a Weberian sense, I don't want anyone to think that we disrespect Simitis or Mitsotakis. Both of the parties, exactly because of those failures, resorted going back to bloodlines of succession, and brought back the nephew of Constantine Karamanlis in one case, and the son of Andreas Papandreou in the other, more or less, around the same time. I mean, only a few years apart, right? I mean, about 6 years apart, this happened in the two parties. So, so if you think about it, right? And the only reason that this was a 6-year apart period is also because if you think about it, right, the succession crisis of the charismatic leaders happened at different points in time in those two parties. So it's not, if you think about it, it's actually almost analogous with a very small deviation. And I think that's what is a succession crisis of a charismatic type of party or movement, right? So that's that. And that kind of completes my answer, I think, to Dimitri's for the second part, and brings me to the term limits question by Martha. First of all, I don't think we can actually, I'm not going to, I'm going to interpret the question from a Weberian perspective, not as a policymaker, right? We don't have the power to change term limits here. But in Greece, we don't really have that tech, let's say, on the books like the US has. I think that question comes from the US kind of context or background, it seems. But I will say that a lot of these charismatic leaders, again, not in the colloquial sense, but in the Weberian sense, often are the kind of leaders who try to overcome those term limits when they're in place. In Greece, we didn't have them. So Andreas Papandreou, if he had lived long enough, he could have been prime minister until he died, even 20 years after he died, right? In theory, right? And he was elected 3 times. So it's not like he was, but in other countries where there were term limits, a lot of this type of charismatic leaders who have polarized society and have been thought of as being, let's say, unique and special and supernatural powers, have actually been the type of leaders, not always, but the type of leaders who would scrap those type of rules and try to institute new rules that fit their desires and goals. So term limits are in danger from charismatic leaders, I would say sometimes. But the reverse, I don't think charismatic leaders themselves would impose such term limits. But if your question is whether society could do that, I'll remind you that the very definition of charismatic leadership is that at least half of society, if not more, believes you have supernatural divine power. So I doubt that they would impose term limits on such a person, right? So I think it would be a contradiction of sorts. Now, do term limits, if they're well institutionalized, can help us against problematic charismatic leaders? Sure. If that's at the heart of your question, yes. And often charismatic leaders are leaders we don't want to associate with such a positively connoted term. But, many of the people you would consider evildoers of the 20th and 21st century could be categorized and would be categorized by Max Weber as charismatic from his perspective, right? Not in any moral sense, but in an analytical sense. I don't want to go into examples, but I think you'll know what I have in mind. So in terms of the refugee crisis, it's an excellent question. And let's see if I can answer on the fly. So I don't think Weber, and again, I'm going to try to see how Weber would address that. I don't think Weber would say much about the content, as I said, again, in relation to Dimitris' question about charismatic versus populist and how they relate. He wouldn't necessarily go into the content of what each type of leader would do with the refugee crisis. He would primarily talk about how this would be perceived or seen by the followers, or how would followers, under what conditions would the people follow, right? So a charismatic leader, whatever they decided, it would be followed by the people who believe them to be charismatic and be viscerally opposed by the others, irrespective of the content. That's the sad, in a way, thing with charismatic leaders, is that some part of society, remember of Eleftherios Venizelos, to the extent that, you follow that part of Greek history, he had made Greece, extend in 3 continents and so on and so forth. And still there were people who hated him and his policies, despite the fact that they were actually really good for, from a Greek national interest perspective. That was irrelevant, right? In fact, they voted him out of office right after the Sevres Treaty was signed in 1920. So that's the key about charismatic leadership, is this element of polarization and how people will take sides. In terms of the traditional one, again, traditional authority often is based on coercion or some sort of traditions that have to do with like hierarchies in society that are unrelated to qualities of the individuals necessarily, or sorry, not the qualities, but the rationale of policy or what have you. So there you would have a more top-down kind of approach of the topic. So we decide and we kind of impose the law. And the rational legal would be the one that would reach its conclusions based on doing, what we would call a cost-benefit analysis, and see what are we, almost like a Benthamite, if you want, probably approach, where we would see what would be the utility maximization principle that we would use, and then come up with like an idea, oh, we have labor shortages on that front, so we need to bring refugees from X backgrounds and so on and so forth. So that type of an approach, I would think. So it would be the one that would say the most about the content, I would say the rational legal version, while the charismatic and the traditional don't have as many, I think, don't carry as many connotations about content of the policy.
Okay, excellent. We have a question from David Maherty, and he asked, does an absence of prominence given to other centers of influence, such as state and city governments, church leaders, journalists, the presidency, or academics, affect the dynamics of charismatic leadership in the Greek national government?
So basically the question, okay, so I think the question was kind of motivated also by my own mention of the fact that Weber himself was influenced, right, by Christian, the Christian church, as he called it, and how it was seen as a charismatic organization itself, right, created by a charismatic leader, and then as such, being a very successful, actually, I forgot to say in the talk, he was impressed, obviously, by how successful as an organization it was, and he basically also went on to analyze the institutionalization of the charisma of the founder, right, of obviously of Jesus Christ. So the point is, like, how do you sustain this organization? Given that the charismatic leader is no longer, at least physically, around. So again, obviously for religious people, that is not a very an interesting discussion, because obviously, it's the divine character of all this that explains it. But he then took all these ideas and tried to apply them to what we would call mundane politics, right? So let me go directly to the question now that I've clarified a little bit of that. So I don't think that the term charisma should be applied in a very different way in the Greek context than in other contexts. That's how I'm reading your question. Sergio, right? Ask this question.
The question was from David Merhardy. It's,
sorry. Okay, sorry. Because there are two questions about the church, that's why I got confused. So the question by David, and then I'm going to answer the question by Sergio. Sorry, I was reading two different questions at the same time. The question by David is, I would say that this is a result rather than a cause. So I would play that Aristotelian game here. The absence of prominence, right, given to other centers of influence, as you say, is a result of a charismatic leadership, rather than those affecting the dynamics, in my view. So it's a chicken egg problem. Of course, once that has happened, of course, also their emaciation, right? The weakness of civil society and all these other institutions exacerbates or makes it easier for charismatic leaders to have their way, right? So it does become a feedback loop. But if we were to trace the lineage, it's not that Greece didn't have ever strong institutions, and I would say that the 80s especially were a period where we did get a lot of emaciation of these, or the weakening of a lot of these institutions, and as a result of centralization and the system becoming more prime minister centric, right? That was another very clear result of what Andreas Papandreou especially did with the constitutional reform, but also with the way he governed, the personalistic style of governance. And that links to the question that Dimitris asked about, the type of rule that Andreas pursued was quite different from Constantine Karamanlis even before the junta on that front. Yeah. So do you want to repeat Sergio's question or someone else's? Because that's linked.
Huh? Yeah, I think Sergio wants to ask it there as well.
Okay. So, yeah.
Perfect. Sergio, you can now talk there as well if you unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself. Good evening, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's the protocol question on every Zoom speaker, terrorized by technology. Thank you for this riveting talk. Your definition of charisma actually reminded me, in addition to St. Paul, 1 Corinthians, of the Iranian concept of chvern or fern, what we call today the aura of a politician. Chvern is actually related to ethics, and it is kind of a superhuman feature. So I was totally beguiled, actually. How do you combine your use of the concept of charisma with the church-state relations? I recall Lucas Papadimos' assertion, Greece is under the protection of the Virgin Mary, we have nothing to fear. It was a declaration that was published in an article, Antiparάθεση προσώπων και γραμμών στη Νεοδημοκρατία, in η Καθημερινή. It was, I guess, November 2011. And this statement was pronounced during a severe political crisis at the time of the formation of the coalition government under Prime Minister Papadimos. This particular deputy has a very crude populist orientation, but the above statement could have easily been evoked, maybe in a more sophisticated fashion, by many of his colleagues across several parties. So let me ask you again. It's weird that I was stunned that you never invoked this aspect while dealing with charisma. How do you combine your use of the concept of charisma with church-state relations?
Yeah, so actually, Lucas Papadimos is not a a very conservative. He's actually the technocrat in this story, right? So it's even more surprising that he used this term from that perspective, right? You would expect him to have a more acute distinction between state and church, right? Adonis Samaras, for example, often said, if God helps us, or you can find a lot more statements like that by that leader of Nea Demokratia, the former president and of Nea Demokratia and prime minister. So there are, and there every day you will hear a lot of Greeks saying things like that. So it's not surprising to anyone who is from Greece. First, I want to thank you for pronouncing charisma in Greek, because that means you can also pronounce my first name correctly, which is Charis. So I have something in common with charisma. Pronounce the same.
Okay. That's the reason you chose this topic. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But besides the joke, I want to. So the reason I didn't go into the thing you're implying, which is the fact that we don't really have much of separation of state and church in Greece, or let's say it's an aspiration for some political forces to have more of a separation of church and state. Actually is orthogonal to my analysis, I think I would argue, of charismatic leadership and its discontents in Greece. Why? First of all, a lot of the charismatic leaders, certainly Andreas Papandreou, were at best agnostic, and only became religiously inclined at the towards the end of his life, and many say under the influence of his late wife, his final, let's say, wife, because he had 3 marriages, Dimitriani. Before that, we don't have any indication that Andreas was devout, or he was using the religious, the religiosity of the Greek people for his career. We wouldn't say the same, though, about the civic religion of Greece. There we can say there is no charismatic leader in Greece that didn't use nationalism, right? The national narrative. But that national narrative in the hands of these charismatic leaders could change quite a bit, right? So it could be reshaped and reconfigured. I mean, Eleftherios Venizelos, for example, a prominent charismatic leader of Greek history, modern Greek history, he believed that anyone, Muslims would become really loyal Greek citizens and would have Greek national consciousness. He said that over and over again in the parliament. It's not, it wasn't even in some, diary or something, right? And, obviously that wouldn't fly into, today's maybe, well, maybe today it would, but it wouldn't fly for decades after he said it, right? After the Asia Minor catastrophe, especially, that was like a no-go zone. But he actually thought of Greek nationalism as going beyond and above Christianity quite a bit, including Jews, of course. Jews of Salonika were very prominent, obviously, in his thinking at that time, because they were a majority minority of the city when it was liberated or annexed to Greece, however you want to discuss it. So so I would say that, again, with the example of Venizelos, who actually addresses this head on and in a way that would be counterintuitive from your perspective, right? But also Andreas Papandreou, who was basically a left-wing politician in his ascent to power, right? And the left wing was not very well known for being in favor of the, intertwined character of church and state in Greece. I would say that it wasn't necessary, in my view, to raise it. Is it an important political issue? Definitely. And it was recently, as you know, Alexis Tsipras probably, tried to do more in terms of separating church and state, and that resulted in quite a bit of a fiasco in the end, right? And nothing changed really. in the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks there. I may have, it's either going to be straightforward or complicated questions. So this for myself, one thing I was struck by when looking at your presentations, you had that graph that had the trust in government versus the trust in parties before, of course, both end up declining precipitously following the financial crisis. One thing I noticed was the trust in government was significantly higher than that in parties. Do we have any data for basically kind of post-2015, if there's more trust in government versus trust in parties? And if so, would that indicate what kind of system is developing, whether kind of a traditional, the rational, or are we going to have a rebirth of some kind of charismatic system along those lines? That kind of thing.
It depends when do you mean exactly? I mean, for a while after I stopped in 2011 there because it was Eurobarometer data. We do now have longer sequence. For the longest time, basically the story is as long as we had memoranda of understanding, both of those were really low. And in fact, also the turnout was terribly low in elections, as you probably know. So all sorts of indicators were correlating that direction. Since the exit from, and I say exit because obviously it's a contested issue to what extent Greece has fully exited the bailout agreements now. But since the formal exit, there have been changes in those, and especially with the COVID-19 situation in Greece, we do have indications that the government, especially Kyriakos Mitsotakis' government dealing with COVID-19, especially initially, had high approval ratings, right? Now, things now are more volatile because things are not going as well. I mean, again, it's still really much better than a lot of other cases, but it's not as well as it was initially. So there are ups and downs, but they're not related to, as directly related to the discussion that we had, obviously, during my talk, which was much more within the context of the international and European crisis. If we were to answer, though, the question of how successful, because the real way I can link your question to my topic is how it relates to the question of whether Kyriakos Mitsotakis will manage to salvage, let's say, New Democracy from its own succession crisis, right? Prolonged succession crisis, or whether, you know, a new political system will emerge at some point where none of these parties created by Constantine Karamanlis and Andreas Papandreou will be around. A lot of it has to do with how successful, obviously, he's in government, right? And then whether he can translate, though, more importantly, whether he can translate that into internal changes in the party where his internal opposition, especially that which legitimates itself through its linkage to the founder, Constantine Karamanlis. So that means through Kostas Karamanlis and through, you know, the other Karamanlis in the party who is now a minister, right? So whether all of these internal oppositions, what we would call, you know, the right wing of New Democracy, or the different factions, whether he will manage to dominate, in quotation marks, from a Weberian point of view, and impose his view of the party, and manage to kind of institutionalize the party and bring about internal party democracy and ways for the party to reproduce itself without being endogenous to, you know, the bloodline from the founder. I'm not going to take a stance on that. I'm just trying to analyze that, right?
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. We have more a comment, I believe here. Even Tsipras used the church just before he got elected during the famous 6th of January Theophania ceremony, holding
Yeah, I mean, for symbolic reasons, yeah, thanks, Joanna. For symbolic reasons, many politicians obviously would, and that goes back to Sergio's point, but this is more like it was obviously, as he remembers and all of you remember, it was obviously taken note, people took notice and made fun to an extent of that, because everybody knows it's a small country and everybody knows who was going to church or who believes or who doesn't and so on and so forth. So it wasn't, that didn't make or break the possibilities of Tsipras being seen as a charismatic leader from his followers, right? It wasn't, that didn't help him for sure, but it didn't hurt him either, I think. But it was neither here nor there, I think. Yeah.
Harry, could I jump in? I have a question. I don't know. You, as a Byzantinist, I don't follow the day-to-day polling of Greek public opinion on the detailed polling, not the party and election projections. Do we have any evidence about the degree to which the patronage-based clientelist type politics have lost their allure, or that the idea that a thesoulas to δημόσιο, a position in the public sector, has through the crisis become less of an aspiration and as a consequence perhaps less significant for capturing the imagination of the Greek electorate?
Excellent question. I mean, yeah, those are, those are the important questions. I agree. It's really hard to know. Vianeosis, this think tank in Greece, is doing some really fascinating surveys called What Do Greeks Believe every now and then. And I think they've done at least 2 waves of that. And that would answer, I have actually a lot of their slides on, which institution, that goes to James' question as well. Which institution would you think comes as first in trust in Greece? What's the most trusted institution in Greece?
Wasn't the army for a period of time or something?
The army is high, but what's the most trusted institution? Think broadly about institutions as a Byzantinist.
Oh, please, not the church.
The family.
Oh.
And that tells you a little bit about, how, and patronage is a lot about thinking like family, right? I mean, nepotism is part of, the problem. And if the institution you trust the most is the family, then it's easy for you to also kind of justify that you hired your nephew or your son or your daughter, right? And I remember, let me share a personal anecdote for those of you especially staying up late in the US context. Not personal, but personal from my memory. I mean, I remember in the beginning when the crisis was raging and PASOK was still struggling to survive in power. Theodoros Pangalos, a very well-known Greek politician, who was still in government, and he was accused. His daughter, it was a scandal back in 2010. His daughter was hired in his office in the Greek parliament or something like that, and there was it became a big scandal. Who would do that, and why did you do that, and so on and so forth. And his answer was like, well, it was legal. I didn't do anything illegal. Like I hired her through the legal means, which is probably true. All of the society was talking about whether it was ethical, right, at the time, especially given that George Papandreou had been elected with like transparency as a big, open government and transparency, and all that in 2009. And I was sitting here in the United States and listening to these TV conversations through TV. And what I was baffled with, which goes back to your question, I was like, why would the daughter of such a prominent minister of the Greek government, who has like a he's an intellectual, he has a PhD, he's like so well read and all that. Why would his daughter, her dream would be to be a public sector, employee? Like I was baffled by that. And nobody ever asked that question. Nobody ever questioned, like nobody said, why would she want, like that was such a normal thing that of course she will covet that, right? Which goes back to your point. Now, of course, many years have passed since then, almost like a decade, since that happened. I don't think that mentality has changed. We had an opportunity, in quotation marks, to delegitimize or deflate is a better term, that whole dream. So the same way we have, in the US, the American dream. In Greece, just to give context to your question, Dimitris, for those of the audience that don't know about it, I would say safely we could say, Dimitris, that getting a good job in the public sector was the Greek dream, the equivalent of the Greek dream, right? You agree? In our generation, at least. Mm-hmm. Now, none of the two of us did that, but that was the thing. For a variety of reasons, we won't go into it. I think that could have been a good legacy of the crisis itself to deflate that, right? And maybe to an extent, you could say there was a way that happened through the brain drain, right? A lot of people were forced, it wasn't a good way to happen, but so many people were forced to flee the country in a way to find employment that, that Greek dream was lost to them, right? Just from the very fact that they were no longer in Greece. So from that perspective, I think the crisis has changed things a bit because of that. The second way the crisis, as I write in one of these pieces I sent you in the chat, the way that it changed was through the fact that because of austerity, there were less opportunities to hire massively in the public sector, as especially the Kostas Karamanlis government did in 2008-2009 period, where the deficit skyrocketed as a result of a lot of these policies. And that also may have inadvertently, it wasn't the goal of the government to do that, but pushed a lot of people in other directions, right? So in a way, in a forced way, it's true that has happened, that has receded. But if you ask me from a mentality point of view, I'm not so sure, right? So in other words, if tomorrow we could hire, 100,000 new employees in the public sector, would we get, a lot more people applying, right? 3 times that number or 10 times that number? Probably yes, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. The mentality, I don't think has necessarily changed, unfortunately.
Hey, do we have any other questions from the audience?
Can I, Jamie, I like the fact that we ended up with Weber, perhaps for my own perverse reasons. I'm reading a lot of Weber these days for my own work. But there is at some point, I feel that when we deal with Greece, we also self-flagellate a bit around these charismatic, populist, because there is always this idea of the perfectly functioning sort of Western world where things are rational, legal. However, let's keep in mind, Skulls and Bones is not rational, legal. Oxbridge is not rational, legal. These are embedded family structures that promote forms of nepotism that everyone considers as glorified elements of a Western kind of rationality. And sometimes in Greece, we need to take stock of that when we articulate our own critiques of the Greek system.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Although obviously a lot of our liberal friends, let's say, would take issue with what you just said, in the sense that they would think that it's almost like by saying that we're advocating against rational legal solutions, right?
No.
But I think I just want to save you from that critique by adding that it's one thing to point our finger or like put our finger on the diagnosis being, misplaced, and it's another thing to endorse several of the pathologies, right? So I'll add to your point by saying I often get invited to these ranking, discussions and roundtables at the Wilson Center or left and right here at State Department. And often they talk about corruption in the Balkans or corruption here or corruption there. And I'm like often telling them, look, guys, a lot of what you have here is institutionalized corruption. And a lot of other parts of the world have informal corruption because it's not institutionalized. So here, if you give a bribe and it's actually taxed, it's fine. But we don't call it a bribe, but it's called a contribution or whatever, like a cut or whatever, but it's taxed. Okay, so it's fine. But in Greece, you don't have that institutional framework, or in Bosnia or Herzegovina or whatever. And then of course it happens under the table and it's corrupt. I'm not saying it's illegal because there is no institutional structure, but that doesn't mean that the practice is not existing in both contexts. It's just a different legal framework that guides it. So it's similar to what you said in the sense that, for example, Constantine Karamanlis had written, a common professor of ours, I guess, had written at some point, about the corruption of the system and the patronage. And he said, well, look, sometimes this could have also helped the development of some of these societies, given that they didn't have other, things. They didn't have those other institutions. Certain things were efficiently, let's say, allocated, or they were actually equally, let's say, efficient than so that goes closer to what you were saying, the Western-centric view, that it doesn't have to be in a certain way to be practical and efficient. But we do know that, as I said, and that goes back to Weber now, we brought it full circle, Weber was worried about charismatic leadership, not because it wasn't efficient, but for the reasons that the talk made apparent, that there are biological limits to a lot of charismatic leaders, all of them. And although charismatic doesn't mean good leader, even if you have a good charismatic leader, which would be the ideal, right? It's a philosopher king kind of thing. They would die, and then you would have chaos. You would have a succession crisis, right? Unless you manage to institutionalize charisma as successfully as certain organizations have done, but that's really rare. Can you think of many associations or organizations that have managed successfully to institutionalize charisma? I don't know that many, right? So that was his worry, and that's why he would often write as if he preferred the rational legal. Do you see what I'm saying? So in a way, the rational legal won out because it was the most lasting in the eyes of many people, rather than because it was the most effective, right? Is that making sense?
And he was very skeptical of the rational legal and its capacity to institutionalize itself and rule undemocratically. So
exactly. And the traditional is another option we didn't talk about, because I think, for example, Kostas Karamanlis, the nephew of Constantine Karamanlis, the founder and the charismatic leader, because he knew he couldn't run the country as a charismatic leader because he wasn't fitting the criteria. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't go rational legal because he was elected from the parts of the party that were electing him to just perpetuate, kind of bring back the bloodline. He ruled in what I would call a traditional type of authority, right? So he did play with those, and that's why, in a way, that kind of exacerbated things moving towards the crisis, right? But that's yet another form of authority. So from that perspective, any of these three forms of authority could do the job, right? Now, the results will be different, right? Going back to the question about the refugee crisis. But Weber was not was trying to keep away from making moral judgments about which one is superior, or even predictions, because a lot will depend on the content, right? And a lot of contingent events that he could not have predicted. Imagine if we didn't have the international financial crisis in 2009. It's very likely that George Papandreou would have been a pretty good prime minister, right? Without the crisis. It's not unlikely, but not in the way that his internal party people who brought him to power because they wanted to keep the bloodline, right, wanted him to be, in a very different style, right? So there is a lot of contingency in this process, right? Nothing is overdetermined. But I think some regularities exist. That's why we do social science, and I do think succession crises are, and I think our audience should clarify that this is not a nomothetic argument. It's not like when A, then B. When you have a charismatic leader, you're going to get a succession crisis that would lead to the demise of a party or something, right? That's not what Weber said. It's a probabilistic statement. It's like when you have a charismatic movement or party and the leader departs, either dies or, becomes a monk or whatever, leaves politics, then he or she have left, the movement, and the movement needs to find a way to move forward. It's very likely that this will lead to a succession crisis, right? That's not necessarily true, but it's likely it will happen, right? And then if that succession crisis doesn't go well, it's likely it will end up in the failure of that movement and in its death in quotation marks. So that's a probability. All steps are probabilistic, and that doesn't mean they're irrelevant or indeterminate, but they're not nomothetic. That's what I wanted to make clear. That's why in the case of Kyriakos Mitsotakis, I think it's very likely, if he does the right things, to actually manage to solve his party, despite the fact that there are all these internal vestiges and legacies of all these, prior, let's say, history of the party. Well, in PASOK, it looks like, at least for now, that they failed in doing everything that was needed to survive as an institution following the departure of the leader. So that I want to stress that, because I don't want people to leave this talk thinking that agency doesn't matter. This is all overdetermined in a very Machiavellian kind of way. I think it's there is a lot of agency, and these are all probabilities.
Okay, I think on that uplifting note, I would end up liking to thank Haris for coming and sharing his expertise. It was very informative for me, and I'm sure the audience as well. A lot to think about going forward, both in terms of Greece and also outside, showing how Greece ends up relating to the world. There's quite a bit there to unpack, so I'm quite happy. And thank you for that, Haris. I would also end up liking to thank the audience for attending and their questions. We had some great questions here, and thank you. I would also end up liking to thank the staff, MEX and IT services, as well as Lauren. Without them, we wouldn't be able to come here together virtually. Finally, I would like to end up reminding everybody that on Wednesday, we're going to be having a film screening live on Zoom at 5:30 Pacific time on Searching for Andreas, the award-winning documentary that I've discussed at the beginning. You'll have the opportunity to watch it, as well as ask questions of Haris himself about the documentary.
Yeah, and I think I will encourage. Thank you so much, James and Dimitri, and everyone, and Lauren, and everyone on the call. I think for the many, may or may not like the film, but definitely will help you put in perspective a lot of what we discussed today, because I think it goes more in depth on some of these issues, primarily focusing on Andreas, but I think it will give you a more concrete ideas to think through what I said today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Dimitri, of course.
No, just thank you, Harry, to Wednesday.
It was a pleasure having a discussion with all of you. Yeah.
It was a pleasure to have you, Harry. Looking forward to Wednesday already.
Bye-bye.
And have a great evening now, everybody. Take care now.